On December 7, 1941, the skies over Pearl Harbor rained fire. Smoke curled from the mangled hulks of naval vessels, and the cries of wounded sailors echoed through the tropical morning. Japanese Zero aviators circled like raptors observing their fallen prey. They had just executed one of history's most devastating surprise assaults. Their arrogance soared as high as their agile aircraft. In their minds, American aerial capabilities were laughable, slow, unwieldy, piloted by the effeminate inhabitants of a soft nation. Rumors had reached them of a novel American interceptor, boasting twin engines and a bifurcated tail. The Americans designated it the P-38 Lightning. Japanese pilots scoffed, dismissing it as another futile attempt by the Americans to rival the peerless Zero. They anticipated another inevitable failure. Little did they know, they were gazing upon their own harbinger of destruction. The year 1941 found the globe engulfed in conflagration. Hitler's Wehrmacht carved a path across Europe, while his Luftwaffe cast a pall over Britain. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, the ascendant emblem of Imperial Japan cast its shadow from its homeland to the recently subjugated territories of Southeast Asia. At the zenith of Japanese aerial prowess stood the Mitsubishi A6M0. This interceptor was so advanced, so nimble, it appeared almost supernatural to those who faced it in combat. The Zero transcended mere machinery. It was an embodiment of a national ethos. Every component, every contour, resonated with the Japanese pursuit of perfection through self-abnegation. Weighing a mere 5,300 pounds when fully armed, the Zero could execute instantaneous turns, ascend with rocket-like velocity, and outmaneuver virtually any Allied combat aircraft. Its 20mm cannons and twin 7.7mm machine guns possessed ample force to dismember enemy machines, while its extraordinary operational radius permitted bomber escorts on missions that defied conventional Western military reasoning. Yet, this superiority came at a profound cost, reflecting the very soul of Imperial Japan. The Zero achieved its remarkable performance by sacrificing pilot security. No armored plating shielded the aviator from enemy fire. No self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic immolation. The Zero was swift and lethal, but inherently vulnerable. A crystalline blade, sharp and deep-cutting, yet easily shattered. This design philosophy mirrored the broader tenets of Japanese military doctrine: victory through spiritual fortitude and tactical genius, even at the cost of immense casualties. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American aviation struggled to keep pace amidst a focus on European theaters. The United States Army Air Forces found themselves equipped with interceptors that seemed almost antiquated compared to the Zero. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, America's primary interceptor in the Pacific, was robust and dependable, but hopelessly outmatched in speed and agility. The Bell P-39 era Cobra, with its distinctive central engine placement, proved effective against ground targets but faltered in high-altitude aerial engagements. These aircraft, conceived in an era of slower speeds and lower altitudes, were suddenly confronted by an adversary that had advanced by an entire generation. The stark disparity became brutally apparent in the early months of 1942. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese pilots annihilated or incapacitated over 300 American aircraft, the majority caught defenseless on the ground. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur's air forces disintegrated under the relentless onslaught of Zero interceptors and twin-engine bombers. The Dutch East Indies succumbed, followed by Singapore, then Burma. Everywhere American and Allied pilots engaged the Zero in combat, the outcome followed a grimly predictable pattern. The Zero ascended higher, executed tighter turns, and struck with greater swiftness. Yet, even as the Japanese military juggernaut swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide, a different kind of transformation was taking shape within the factories and design studios of Southern California. Within the expansive facilities of Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, a team of engineers, spearheaded by the brilliant Clarence Kelly Johnson, was finalizing what they hoped would be America's answer to the Zero. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning embodied everything the Zero was not. While the Zero eschewed protection for performance, the Lightning enveloped its pilot in protective armor and shatterproof glass. Where the Zero relied on a solitary engine for power, The Lightning boasted two colossal Allison 1710 engines, each generating in excess of 1,400 horsepower. The Zero's conventional design spoke of evolutionary refinement, whereas the Lightning's twin-boom configuration announced a revolutionary leap forward. The initial encounter between Japanese intelligence officers and photographic representations of the P-38 elicited a swift and contemptuous response. The aircraft resembled something from a science fiction periodical, its twin engines mounted on separate nacelles connected by a central fuselage housing the pilot and weaponry. The Japanese christened it Futago no Akuma, the Twin Devil, a moniker infused with derision rather than dread. How could such an ungainly contraption possibly pose a threat to the elegant, refined Zero? This confidence was not entirely unfounded. Early engagements between P-38s and Japanese fighters in 1942 frequently favored the Zero pilots. Lightning aviators, fresh from training grounds in America's heartland, faced seasoned combat veterans who had been engaged in China since 1937. These Japanese aces possessed intimate knowledge of every aerial combat maneuver, every avenue to exploit an adversary's vulnerability. They had perfected the art of the turning engagement, leveraging the Zero's exceptional agility to force opponents into deadly spirals, culminating in 20-millimeter cannon shells tearing through cockpits. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, already one of Japan's most lauded aces with over 30 confirmed kills, encountered his inaugural P-38 over Guadalcanal in August 1942. The Lightning pilot, likely a young American barely out of flight school, committed the cardinal error of attempting to outturn Sakai's Zero. The Japanese ace smirked beneath his oxygen mask as he initiated a climbing turn that would have incapacitated most pilots. The P-38, heavier and less agile, could not replicate the maneuver. Within minutes, Sakai positioned himself perfectly for a kill shot. However, something unforeseen occurred. As Sakai closed for the final blow, the P-38 suddenly accelerated away with startling velocity. The Lightning's twin engines, each exceeding the power of the Zero's solitary power plant, granted it a straight-line speed advantage previously unimagined by the Japanese pilot. Sakai advanced his throttle, but the Zero simply could not match the Lightning's acceleration. He watched with mounting frustration as his quarry vanished into the distance, presumably en route to Henderson Field to fight another day. This scenario played out repeatedly across the Pacific as 1942 transitioned into 1943. Japanese pilots, accustomed to dominating every engagement, found themselves confronting an adversary that refused to adhere to established conventions. The P-38 eschewed the turning fight, where the Zero held every advantage. Instead, Lightning pilots developed novel tactics that exploited their aircraft's unique strengths: superior velocity, devastating offensive capabilities, and the capacity for rapid ascent to altitudes where the Zero's performance began to degrade. The Lightning's armament represented another radical departure from conventional fighter design. Rather than wing-mounted guns necessitating pilot calculations for convergence angles and ammunition mixing, the P-38 concentrated all its weaponry in the nose. One 20-millimeter cannon and four 50-caliber machine guns, all firing directly forward along the aircraft's center line. When a Lightning pilot squeezed the trigger, a concentrated torrent of destruction was unleashed, capable of dismembering enemy aircraft with surgical precision. American aviators began to grasp that the key to defeating the Zero lay not in matching its strengths, but in imposing their own advantages. The boom and zoom tactic became the Lightning's signature. A rapid dive from altitude, a high-speed assault, followed by a swift climb back to safety before the Zero could retaliate. This strategy demanded discipline and patience, qualities that American pilots, schooled in the methodical traditions of their military, possessed in abundance. Second Lieutenant Richard Dick Bong arrived in the Pacific Theater in September 1942, freshly graduated from advanced fighter training in California. At 22 years of age, he appeared even younger, with an innocent countenance more suited to a high school yearbook than the cockpit of a fighter. His fellow pilots in the 49th Fighter Group, observing this farm boy from Wisconsin, wondered if he would survive his inaugural week of combat. Bong's initial encounter with Japanese fighters occurred over New Guinea, where the 49th Fighter Group was tasked with providing aerial support for Australian ground forces. As his flight of P-38s ascended to their patrol altitude, Bong spotted a formation of Japanese bombers, escorted by Zero fighters. His flight leader, a veteran with several months of Pacific combat experience, signaled for the attack. What transpired next would be replicated hundreds of times over the subsequent 2 years, but this initial engagement established the pattern. Bong positioned his Lightning above and behind the Japanese formation, utilizing the sun to obscure his approach. As he commenced his dive, his P-38 accelerated to over 400 miles per hour, far exceeding the speed of any Zero. His target, a twin-engine bomber, rapidly filled his gun sight. The concentrated firepower of the Lightning's nose-mounted armament proved devastating. Bong's initial burst tore through the bomber's starboard engine, sending fragments of metal spinning into the slipstream. His second burst struck the fuel tanks, and the Japanese aircraft erupted in a ball of orange flame that momentarily eclipsed the tropical sun. Bong pulled up sharply, his P-38's potent engines carrying him to safety before the escorting Zeros could react. However, it was not solely mechanical advantages that began to tip the scales. American pilots introduced an element to the Pacific War that their Japanese counterparts, for all their skill and experience, could not replicate. An industrial support system that seemed almost miraculous in its sheer volume. When a Lightning returned from a mission bearing battle damage, teams of mechanics swarmed it with replacement parts, tools, and expertise. Damaged engines were exchanged overnight. Bullet impacts were patched with aluminum sheets cut to precise specifications. Electronic components were repaired or replaced with parts rolling off American production lines in seemingly inexhaustible quantities. The contrast with Japanese maintenance capabilities became stark as 1943 progressed. Zero fighters, once perceived as invincible, began to exhibit signs of wear and rudimentary repairs. Replacement parts became scarce, compelling mechanics to cannibalize damaged aircraft to keep others operational. Most critically, the cadre of experienced Japanese pilots began to diminish as combat losses mounted, and training programs struggled to replace veteran aviators. The P-38's technological superiority extended far beyond raw speed and firepower. The Lightning's twin-engine configuration offered redundancy, proving invaluable over the vast distances of Pacific combat. When a Zero sustained battle damage to its single engine, the pilot faced a grim choice: attempt a perilous landing on enemy-held territory, or ditch in shark-infested waters. When a Lightning lost an engine, the pilot could often return to base on the remaining power plant, surviving to fight another day. The aircraft's high-altitude performance became particularly crucial as the war advanced. The Lightning's turbocharged engines maintained their power output at altitudes where the Zero's naturally aspirated engine began to struggle for air. At 25,000 feet, a P-38 could outrun, outclimb, and outgun any Japanese fighter in the sky. This altitudinal advantage permitted Lightning pilots to dictate the terms of engagement, controlling the tempo of aerial combat in a manner that Japanese pilots found increasingly vexing. Perhaps most significantly, the P-38's extended range began to reorient the strategic balance of the Pacific War. The Lightning could escort bombers on missions extending over 1,500 miles, far beyond the reach of shorter-ranged fighters. This enhanced range enabled American forces to strike deep into Japanese-occupied territory while maintaining fighter protection, a capability that proved pivotal as the island-hopping campaign gained momentum. The psychological ramifications of these technological advantages cannot be overstated. Japanese pilots, who once approached every engagement with supreme confidence, now found themselves glancing over their shoulders, scanning the heavens for the distinctive twin-boom silhouette of approaching Lightnings. The aircraft they had once derided as ungainly and ineffective had become an emblem of American industrial might and technological innovation. By early 1943, the laughter had ceased within Japanese fighter squadrons across the Pacific. Intelligence reports filtering back to Tokyo painted an increasingly bleak picture. American P-38 squadrons were achieving kill ratios that seemed almost unattainable. Where Japanese pilots had once anticipated downing 3 or 4 American fighters for every Zero lost, they now confronted adversaries who struck with devastating efficacy and vanished before retaliation was feasible. This transformation became particularly evident in the skies over the Solomon Islands, where the struggle for Guadalcanal had evolved into a broader campaign for dominion over the entire island chain. Here, in the crucible of daily combat, American Lightning pilots perfected the tactics that would ultimately sweep Japanese aviation from the Pacific firmament. Major Thomas Maguire, another young American pilot destined to become one of the war's leading aces, described this evolution in a missive to his wife. "The Japs used to come at us like they own the sky. Now they're cautious, defensive. They know we can hurt them, and they're starting to show it. The P-38 has given us something we never had before, the ability to fight on our terms instead of theirs." But the true test was yet to unfold. As 1943 progressed toward its climactic confrontations, both sides prepared for engagements that would shape the future of aerial warfare in the Pacific. The Japanese, acknowledging the menace posed by the Lightning, commenced the development of new tactics and aircraft, specifically engineered to counter American advantages. The Americans, meanwhile, continued to refine their techniques, while new squadrons of P-38s arrived in theater, their pilots rigorously trained in the boom and zoom methodologies that capitalized on the Lightning's strengths. The stage was set for a series of aerial engagements that would definitively determine whether Japanese confidence in their pilots and aircraft was warranted, or whether American industrial might and technological innovation could surmount the warrior traditions of the samurai. In the heavens above the Pacific, the laughter had fallen silent. Now came the reckoning. The twin-tailed devil, once dismissed by Japanese pilots as a mere curiosity, was poised to reveal its true nature. And when it did, the balance of power in the Pacific War would shift irrevocably, etched in contrails and punctuated by the thunderous roar of twin Allison engines descending from the sun. On April 18, 1943, high above Bougainville Island, 16 P-38, Lightning streaked through the morning sky at 20,000 feet. Their twin engines left 4 parallel vapor trails against the azure Pacific canvas. Leading this formation was Major John Mitchell, a seasoned pilot whose placid demeanor belied the intensity of the impending mission. Today, the Lightning would face its ultimate trial, not against ordinary Japanese fighters, but against the mastermind of the Pearl Harbor assault himself. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant strategist who orchestrated Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, was en route to Bougainville for a morale-boosting tour of forward installations. American codebreakers had intercepted his flight plan, and 18 carefully selected P-38 pilots had been assigned to what military planners euphemistically termed an interception. In reality, they were undertaking an assassination mission that would test every advantage the Lightning held over Japanese aviation. The irony was profound. Yamamoto himself had cautioned his superiors that attacking America would awaken a sleeping giant. Now, that giant's industrial might had produced the very weapon that would claim his life, a fighter aircraft embodying every apprehension he harbored regarding American technological prowess. As Mitchell's Lightnings approached the interception point, they sighted their quarry, 2 Mitsubishi G4 M Betty bombers carrying Yamamoto and his staff, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The Japanese pilots, engaged in a routine transport mission, had no inkling they were about to encounter the most meticulously planned aerial ambush of the Pacific War. Captain Thomas Lanphier, Jr., flying as Mitchell's wingman, spotted the Japanese formation first. The 2 Betty bombers were flying low over the jungle canopy, precisely as intelligence had predicted. Their Zero escorts weaved lazily above, their pilots likely more concerned with navigation than enemy fighters. Operating deep within Japanese-controlled airspace, hundreds of miles from the nearest American base. What the Japanese pilots failed to grasp was that the P-38's extraordinary range had made this mission feasible. No other Allied fighter in the Pacific possessed the fuel capacity to traverse 435 miles to the target area, engage in combat, and return safely to base. The Lightning's twin-boom configuration, once mocked by Japanese pilots as ungainly, housed fuel tanks that bestowed upon it capabilities unattainable by any single-engine fighter. The assault unfolded with devastating precision. Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber dove toward the bombers, while the remainder of the formation engaged the Zero escorts. The Japanese fighters, caught completely unawares, struggled to counter the Lightning's superior speed and altitudinal advantage. In the ensuing turning fight, The Zero's legendary maneuverability proved futile against adversaries unwilling to engage in such maneuvers. Lanfear's P-38 closed on the lead Betty bomber with astonishing velocity. The Lightning's concentrated nose armament, comprising a 20mm cannon and 450 caliber machine guns, unleashed a torrent of destruction no bomber could withstand. The Betty's starboard engine exploded in a geyser of flame and metal. The aircraft rolled inverted and plunged into the jungle below, carrying with it the man who had conceived Pearl Harbor. The second bomber met a similar fate under Barber's guns. Within minutes, both Bettys lay as burning wreckage in the Bougainville jungle, and the surviving Zero pilots fled toward their home base, their confidence shattered by an encounter with an enemy they believed they understood. The death of Yamamoto sent shockwaves through the Japanese military hierarchy. However, the psychological impact extended far beyond the loss of a single leader. For Japanese pilots across the Pacific, the successful interception signified something far more disquieting than mere tactical defeat. It demonstrated that American fighters could now strike anywhere, at any time, with impunity. Lieutenant Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, one of Japan's most celebrated aces with over 80 confirmed victories, encountered this new reality firsthand during a mission over Rabaul in June 1943. Nishizawa, known among his fellow pilots as the Devil of Rabaul, had built his reputation on the Zero's superior maneuverability and his own exceptional flying skills, having never met an American pilot capable of matching him in a turning fight. Yet, when Nishizawa's formation encountered a squadron of P-38s over New Britain, the Americans refused to adhere to the established rules. Instead of descending to engage in a traditional dogfight, the Lightning pilots maintained their altitudinal advantage and attacked in coordinated waves, each assault lasting mere seconds. A swift descent, a barrage of intense fire, then an ascent to safety before the Zeros could retaliate. Nishizawa watched with growing vexation as his comrade's fighter disintegrated under the concentrated firepower of a Lightning. The American aviator responsible for the destruction was already accelerating away, his dual engines propelling him beyond the range of any reprisal. For the initial instance in his entire combat tenure, Nishizawa felt powerless. His exceptional piloting prowess was rendered insignificant if he could not compel his adversaries to engage on his chosen terms. This profound shift in morale permeated beyond individual pilots, affecting entire squadrons. Japanese fighter formations, which had once approached every sortie with unwavering assurance, now found themselves casting anxious glances at the empty sky, acutely aware that demise could plummet from the sun at 400 miles per hour without warning. The straightforward triumphs of 1942 became progressively scarce as American pilots mastered the exploitation of every advantage their aircraft offered. This was industrial warfare. Beneath the surface of tactical refinement lay a more extensive transformation that Japanese military strategists were only beginning to grasp. The P-38 Lightning represented far more than a merely superior fighter aircraft. It embodied the formidable might of American industrial output directed towards wartime production. In factories spanning the United States, the Lightning assembly line operated with an efficiency that would have seemed inconceivable to Japanese observers. Lockheed's Burbank facility alone manufactured over 200 P-38s monthly by the middle of 1943, with additional production hubs in other cities augmenting the total output. Each aircraft emerged from the assembly line outfitted with the most current technological enhancements: more potent engines, enhanced armor protection, improved radio systems, and increasingly advanced armaments. The disparity with Japanese manufacturing capabilities grew more pronounced with each passing month. While American factories churned out Lightnings by the hundreds, Japanese aircraft production grappled with shortages of essential materials, issues with quality control, and the persistent threat of American aerial bombardments. The Zero fighters that had once appeared invincible now exhibited signs of diminished construction quality as seasoned technicians were conscripted into military service, and critical components became difficult to procure. Crucially, the Americans were producing pilots at a pace that Japanese training programs could not match. Flight academies across the United States were graduating thousands of new aviators every month, many specifically schooled in the tactics that maximized the P-38's strengths. These pilots arrived in the Pacific Theater with hundreds of hours of flight experience and extensive gunnery instruction, prepared to implement the hard-won lessons of their predecessors. Aces emerged. It was within this milieu of technological and tactical advancement that a new generation of American fighter aces began to distinguish themselves. These pilots, at the controls of aircraft that finally matched or surpassed Japanese performance, started achieving kill ratios that appeared almost unattainable to their predecessors, who flew P-40s and P-30s during the bleak early days of 1942. Richard Bong, the unassuming farm boy from Wisconsin, became the living embodiment of this transition. By the close of 1943, Bong had amassed 21 confirmed aerial victories, establishing him as one of America's foremost aces. More significantly, his accomplishments underscored how the P-38's capabilities could be fully leveraged by pilots who understood both the aircraft's inherent strengths and their enemy's vulnerabilities. Bong's typical combat engagement followed a pattern that became standard for Lightning pilots throughout the Pacific. Capitalizing on the P-38's superior rate of climb and high-altitude performance, he positioned himself above Japanese formations before they detected his presence. When he initiated his attack, it was with the devastating velocity and firepower that the Lightning's design facilitated. And should Japanese fighters attempt to counter, Bong employed his aircraft's superior speed to disengage and regain altitude for another assault. The psychological toll on Japanese pilots became palpable in their radio communications, which American intelligence intercepted and translated. Where Japanese pilots had once reported engaging inferior American aircraft, they now spoke of twin-engine Spectres that struck without warning and vanished before any retaliation could be mounted. The confident banter that characterized Japanese radio traffic in 1942 gave way to anxious exchanges between pilots who realized they were confronting an adversary they did not fully comprehend. Technological evolution. As 1943 segued into 1944, the P-38 Lightning continued its progression, integrating lessons learned from thousands of hours of combat in the Pacific. The P-38J model, which began entering squadron service in late 1943, addressed many of the earlier aircraft's limitations while enhancing its already formidable capabilities. The improved engines in the new models generated over 1,600 horsepower each, granting the Lightning a top speed approaching 420 miles per hour, fast enough to intercept any Japanese fighter in level flight. More critically, the P-38J's enhanced high-altitude performance enabled it to operate effectively at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to maintain engine power. Perhaps the most significant advancement, however, came in the form of novel tactics and training programs specifically developed for Lightning pilots. American flight schools now emphasized energy management, the art of converting altitude and speed into strategic advantage. Students were taught to think in 3 dimensions, utilizing the Lightning's superior climb rate and dive speed to dictate the pace of aerial engagements. These tactical innovations proved their immense value in the pivotal air battles of 1944, as American forces commenced their island-hopping campaign towards the Japanese home islands. Over the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and subsequently the Philippines, P-38 squadrons achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-1 against Japanese opposition. The aircraft that Japanese pilots had once disparaged as a mere curiosity had transformed into the instrument of their aerial undoing. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, June 19, 1944. The Philippine Sea stretched limitlessly in every direction, its surface disturbed only by the wakes of the largest naval armada ever assembled. Task Force 58, the rapid carrier force of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, steamed towards the Mariana Islands with 15 aircraft carriers and nearly 900 aircraft. Opposing them was the Japanese Mobile Fleet, carrying the last significant concentration of naval aviation that the empire could muster. The stage was thus set for what would become known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a battle that would unequivocally demonstrate the complete metamorphosis of aerial warfare in the Pacific. At the heart of this transformation lay the P-38 Lightning. No longer the experimental oddity that Japanese pilots had ridiculed in 1942, it had become a proven instrument of aerial supremacy. Lieutenant Alexander Vatsu, flying from the carrier USS Lexington, first detected the initial wave of Japanese attackers while on combat air patrol. The formation comprised over 60 aircraft, including Zero fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, representing one of the largest Japanese aerial assaults since Pearl Harbor. Yet, as Vatsu examined the approaching enemy through his gun sight, he observed something that would have been utterly unthinkable 2 years prior. The Japanese pilots were flying defensively, grouped tightly together for mutual protection, rather than dispersed for maximum offensive impact. The ensuing engagement unfolded with a lopsided ferocity that astonished even veteran American pilots. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft plunged towards the American fleet, only to be met by coordinated assaults from P-38s and other American fighters. The Lightning pilots, now veterans of 2 years of Pacific combat, executed their attacks with mechanical precision. They dove from altitude, unleashed devastating salvos of concentrated firepower, and then ascended to safety before Japanese fighters could respond. In a single day, American pilots claimed over 400 Japanese aircraft destroyed, while losing only 29 of their own. The P-38 Lightning was credited with a substantial portion of these victories, its pilots capitalizing on every advantage afforded by 2 years of combat experience and technological refinement. The end of an era. As the sun dipped below the horizon over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, more than just Japanese aircraft burned in the Pacific waters. The myth of Japanese aerial invincibility, painstakingly constructed upon the Zero's early dominance and the skill of veteran pilots, perished with them. The laughter that had once greeted the ungainly, twin-tailed Lightning had been supplanted by the somber silence of defeat. For the Japanese pilots who survived the turkey shoot, the lesson was stark and unmistakable. The war in the Pacific skies had been irrevocably altered. The aircraft they had once dismissed as inferior had become the instrument of their destruction, piloted by men who had learned to maximize every advantage that technological innovation could provide. Yet, the Lightning's ascendancy signified more than mere tactical triumph. It embodied the comprehensive transformation of American military aviation, evolving from the desperate improvisations of 1942 to the overwhelming superiority of 1944. The fork-tailed devil had proven that wars are not won solely through individual courage and skill, but by the capacity to mass-produce weaponry that bestows extraordinary capabilities upon ordinary pilots. The mockery had ceased. The reckoning had commenced. And in the vast expanse of the Pacific skies, the twin engines of the P-38 Lightning sang a powerful anthem of American industrial might that would resonate all the way to Tokyo Bay. October 1944. The skies above Leyte Gulf blazed with the intensity of the largest naval confrontation in human history. Below, American and Japanese fleets engaged in a desperate struggle that would ultimately determine the fate of the Philippines and, by extension, the entire Pacific War. Above this maritime carnage, a different kind of conflict raged, one that symbolized the complete reversal of fortune that had revolutionized aerial warfare in the Pacific. Major Richard Dick Bong, by then America's leading ace with 36 confirmed victories, guided a formation of P-38 Lightnings through the smoke-laden atmosphere over the Philippine Islands. Just 2 years earlier, American pilots in this very airspace would have been engaged in desperate defensive missions, striving merely to survive against overwhelming Japanese air superiority. Now, Bong and his fellow Lightning pilots hunted with the confidence of predators aware that their prey could no longer evade them. The transformation was absolute and devastating. Japanese pilots, who had once dominated the Pacific skies, now flew with the hunted desperation of men, cognizant that each mission might be their final. The Zero fighters that had seemed invincible in 1942 had become flying coffins, their pilots reduced to hoping they could inflict some measure of damage before the inevitable lightning assault tore them from the heavens. However, this shift in fortunes narrated a story deeper than simple tactical evolution. It represented the triumph of American industrial capacity over Japanese military tradition, of technological innovation over individual prowess, and of systematic training over a warrior mystique. The P-38 Lightning had transcended its status as a mere superior fighter aircraft to become the very instrument through which American industrial power had fundamentally reshaped the nature of aerial combat. The Philippines Crucible, the campaign to reclaim the Philippines, served as the ultimate proving ground for demonstrating the Lightning's complete dominance over Japanese aviation. General Douglas MacArthur's return to the islands he had been compelled to abandon in 1942 hinged critically on achieving absolute air supremacy, and the P-38 squadrons of the 5th and 13th Air Forces had become his principal instruments for accomplishing this objective. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McGuire, flying with the 475th Fighter Group, exemplified the new generation of Lightning pilots who had mastered the exploitation of every advantage their aircraft afforded. McGuire, who would ultimately ascend to become America's second highest-ranking ace with 38 confirmed victories, approached aerial combat with the methodical precision of an engineer rather than the romantic individualism that had characterized earlier fighter pilots. On a typical mission over Luzon in November of 1944, McGuire's tactics vividly illustrated how thoroughly the Lightning had transformed aerial warfare in the Pacific. Leading a formation of 16 P-38s, he detected a Japanese formation attempting to assault American ground forces near Manila. The Japanese pilots, flying a mix of Zeros and newer aircraft like the Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony, adopted a defensive posture, flying bunched together for mutual protection. McGuire's response adhered to the tactical doctrine that Lightning pilots had perfected over 2 years of Pacific combat. Rather than plunging immediately into the enemy formation, he positioned his aircraft to achieve maximum advantage. Utilizing the P-38's superior climb rate, he gained altitude until his formation commanded a superior position above the Japanese fighters. Then, when conditions were optimal, he struck with devastating accuracy. The assault unfolded with mechanical efficiency. McGuire's Lightnings dove in coordinated waves, each pilot selecting a target and unleashing a concentrated burst of firepower before climbing back to altitude. The Japanese pilots, hampered by their aircraft's inferior high-altitude performance and their own inherently defensive mindset, could only watch helplessly as their formation disintegrated under the Lightning's systematic assault. Within minutes, 8 Japanese aircraft were plunging towards the Philippine jungle in flames, while McGuire's formation ascended back to altitude without sustaining a single loss. This engagement encapsulated everything. The Lightning had become fast, lethal, and utterly dominant over adversaries who had once seemed invincible. The technology of dominance. By late 1944, the P-38 Lightning had evolved into a weapons system representing the zenith of American aviation technology. The P-38L model, now rolling off production lines in unprecedented numbers, incorporated every lesson learned from 3 years of Pacific combat. Its twin Allison V-1710 engines, each producing over 1,600 horsepower, granted it a top speed of 414 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 44,000 feet. Performance figures that no Japanese fighter could rival. However, raw performance statistics only told a portion of the story. The Lightning's true advantage resided in its systematic integration of multiple technologies that functioned synergistically to create overwhelming tactical superiority. Its concentrated nose armament eliminated the convergence issues that plagued wing-mounted guns. Its twin-engine configuration offered redundancy, enabling pilots to survive combat damage that would doom single-engine fighters. Its exceptional range facilitated operations deep within enemy territory, where shorter-range fighters could not venture. Perhaps most crucially, the Lightning's high-altitude performance enabled it to control the vertical dimension of aerial combat. At altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet, where the rarefied air deprived Japanese engines of power, the Lightning's turbocharged engines maintained full performance. This altitude advantage empowered Lightning pilots to dictate when and where engagements occurred, controlling the tempo of aerial combat in a manner that Japanese pilots found increasingly frustrating and, ultimately, hopeless. The psychological ramifications of this technological dominance cannot be overstated. Japanese pilots, who had once approached every engagement with unwavering confidence, now found themselves scanning empty skies with anxious desperation, knowing that death could descend from the sun at any moment. Radio intercepts revealed the pervasive extent of this psychological transformation. Where Japanese pilots had formerly reported engaging inferior American fighters, They now spoke in hushed tones of twin-engine devils that struck without warning and vanished before retaliation was possible. The human dimension. Beneath the surface of technological superiority lay a human narrative that mirrored the broader transformation of American military aviation. The Lightning pilots of 1944 represented a new cadre of aviators, systematically trained, technologically equipped, and tactically sophisticated in ways their predecessors could never have envisioned. Captain Charles McDonald, flying with the 475th Fighter Group, epitomized this evolution. McDonald, who would conclude the war with 27 confirmed victories, approached aerial combat with the analytical mindset of a professional rather than the romantic individualism that had characterized earlier fighter pilots. He meticulously studied his opponent's tactics, analyzed their weaknesses, and devised systematic approaches to leverage the Lightning's advantages. In a letter to his wife, McDonald described the profound shift. The Japanese pilots we're fighting now aren't the same men who attacked Pearl Harbor. Those veterans are mostly dead or grounded. The new pilots are brave enough, but they're flying aircraft that can't match our capabilities, and they're using tactics that worked against P-40s, but are suicide against P-38s. It's almost unfair, except that I remember what they did to us in 1942. This human element extended beyond individual pilots to encompass entire squadrons and air groups. The Lightning units operating in the Philippines represented the culmination of 3 years of tactical evolution, technological refinement, and systematic training. These pilots possessed an intimate understanding of their aircraft's capabilities, a complete grasp of their opponent's vulnerabilities, and executed their missions with a precision reflecting both superior equipment and superior preparation. The contrast with Japanese aviation grew increasingly stark as 1944 transitioned into 1945. While American pilots arrived in theater with extensive combat training, Japanese pilots were increasingly thrust into combat with minimal preparation. The veteran aviators who had once made the Zero so formidable were largely deceased, and their replacements lacked both the experience and the aircraft to match American capabilities. The final campaigns. As American forces closed in on the Japanese home islands in early 1945, the P-38 Lightning faced its ultimate test: operations over Japan itself. The long-range missions required to escort BM-29 bombers from bases in the Marianas to targets in Japan stretched even the Lightning's exceptional capabilities to their limits. However, these missions also highlighted the aircraft's unique suitability for Pacific warfare. The Iwo Jima campaign in February and March of 1945 provided a critical stepping stone for these extended operations. P-38 squadrons operating from the captured airfields on Iwo Jima could now escort bombers all the way to Tokyo and back, a capability that no other Allied fighter possessed. The Lightning's twin-engine reliability proved indispensable on these marathon missions, where a single engine failure over the vast Pacific meant almost certain demise. Major William Shomo, flying with the 82nd Fighter Squadron, demonstrated the Lightning's continued effectiveness even against Japan's newest fighters. During a mission over Luzon in January of 1945, Shomo encountered a formation of Japanese aircraft that included some of the Empire's most advanced fighters, the Kawasaki Ki-84 Hayate and the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate. These aircraft represented Japan's desperate attempt to develop fighters that could rival American capabilities. The ensuing engagement proved that technological advancement alone could not overcome the systemic advantages that American pilots now enjoyed. Shomo's P-38, flown with the tactical sophistication honed by 3 years of combat, systematically destroyed 7 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement. The Japanese pilots, flying superior aircraft but lacking the training, experience, and tactical doctrine that American pilots had developed, proved helpless against an adversary who had mastered the art of maximizing every advantage. The kamikaze response. As conventional Japanese aviation proved increasingly ineffective against American air superiority, the Empire resorted to its final desperate measure, the kamikaze attacks that would characterize the war's closing months. Flyers, once adept at pursuing Japanese adversaries, now confront adversaries who have relinquished all hope of self-preservation, opting instead for catastrophic, all-out assaults designed for maximum devastation. This profound alteration in the enemy's mindset deeply affects the seasoned flyers, who have dedicated 3 years to mastering the intricacies of airborne engagements. Captain Richard Dick Bong, presently America's preeminent fighter ace with 40 confirmed aerial victories, conveys this shift in a personal dispatch. They no longer engage with the objective of prevailing. Their focus is on perishing, a factor that amplifies their peril despite their inferior aircraft. One can anticipate the actions of a pilot driven by reason. However, how does one counter an individual who has already embraced their demise? The superior velocity and formidable firepower of the Lightning prove indispensable in repelling suicide attacks, yet the psychological strain on American aviators becomes undeniable. These individuals, who have invested years in cultivating the expertise and strategies required to achieve supremacy over Japanese aviation, now find themselves facing foes who have discarded the very notion of survival that underpins all military aerial operations. The ultimate triumph. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's proclamation of surrender reverberates across radio waves throughout the Pacific, marking the cessation of humanity's most devastating global conflict. For the P-38 Lightning pilots stationed on airfields from the Philippines to Iwo, this juncture signifies the culmination of a transformation that commenced with derision and concluded with absolute mastery. The figures themselves articulate this narrative with stark precision. Lightning pilots have achieved kill-to-loss ratios exceeding 10-1 against Japanese forces, accumulating more than 1,000 confirmed victories while losing fewer than 200 of their own aircraft to enemy action. The very aircraft that Japanese pilots initially dismissed as an awkward anomaly has evolved into the instrument of their comprehensive aerial defeat. Yet, the Lightning's success transcends mere tactical achievement. It symbolizes the triumph of structured training over individual valor and the ascendancy of technological advancement over the romanticized ideal of the warrior. This formidable twin-tailed aircraft has definitively demonstrated that modern warfare is not the domain of the exceptionally brave or skilled individual combatant, but rather that of the nation capable of seamlessly integrating industrial output, innovative technology, and disciplined training into an overwhelming military might. Legacy, and introspection. As the final P-38 Lightning sorties traverse the now tranquil Pacific skies, the aircraft's enduring impact extends far beyond its remarkable combat statistics. The Lightning has fundamentally reshaped the character of aerial combat, proving that strategically applied technological superiority can overcome even the most proficient and resolute adversaries. The Japanese pilots who once scoffed at the Lightning's unconventional design have learned through harsh experience that wars are not won by personal courage or aesthetic appeal of aircraft, but by the disciplined deployment of superior technology and tactics. The Zero's graceful contours and renowned agility proved inconsequential against an opponent that refused to engage on terms dictated by Japan. For American aviation, the Lightning's triumph validates the industrial and technological philosophy that would define military aviation for many years to come. The aircraft's distinctive twin-engine configuration, concentrated armament, and emphasis on pilot protection established design tenets that would influence fighter aircraft development well into the jet age. However, perhaps the Lightning's most significant contribution lies in its demonstration that air dominance, once secured through superior technology and strategy, could be consistently maintained and leveraged to achieve decisive strategic outcomes. The aircraft that began the war as an experimental curiosity concluded it as the primary tool through which American air power asserted complete control over the Pacific theater. The initial laughter has long since faded. Mockery has yielded to apprehension, then to dread, and ultimately to the quietude of defeat. In summation, the P-38 Lightning proved that in the realm of contemporary warfare, ultimate victory belongs not to the most aesthetically pleasing or conventionally designed machine, but to the aircraft that most effectively harmonizes technological innovation with strategic astuteness. The fork-tailed adversary has exacted its retribution, and the Pacific sky will forever bear the imprint of its dominance. Concluding reflections. The narrative of the P-38 Lightning's involvement in the Pacific War is, at its core, a chronicle of profound evolution. It is the story of American aviation's transformation from reactive improvisation to overwhelming dominance, the metamorphosis of aerial tactics from individual acts of bravery to systematic warfare, and the shift in the Pacific theater from Japanese ascendancy to American victory. When Japanese pilots first encountered the Lightning in 1942, their amusement stemmed from a confidence forged through 2 years of uninterrupted success. Their assurance was well-founded, their aircraft was superior, their pilots were seasoned, and their strategies had proven devastatingly effective against every foe they had encountered. Yet, they failed to recognize that they were witnessing the genesis of a new form of warfare, one where individual skill and aircraft elegance would be overshadowed by industrial capacity and technological innovation. The Lightning represented not merely a new aircraft, but a novel approach to aerial engagement that would fundamentally redefine the very nature of air combat. This transformation was neither instantaneous nor preordained. It necessitated 3 years of grueling conflict, countless hours dedicated to tactical refinement, and the disciplined application of American industrial power to achieve the supremacy that characterized the war's concluding campaigns. But once attained, this dominance proved so absolute that Japanese aviation never recovered its former standing. Today, as we reflect upon this monumental shift, we can perceive within the Lightning's success a precursor to the technologically driven warfare that would define the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The aircraft that Japanese pilots once derided as awkward has become an emblem of the systematic embrace of military technology that continues to shape modern conflict. The twin-tailed Devil demonstrated that in war, much like in numerous other human undertakings, the ultimate triumph belongs not to those who commence with assurance, but to those who unite innovation, steadfastness, and the strategic deployment of superior resources to achieve their objectives. The P-38 Lightning did more than secure air superiority over the Pacific. It redefined the potential and scope of air dominance when applied effectively. The laughter that once resounded through Japanese fighter squadrons has been supplanted by the enduring silence of history. However, the lessons learned from the Lightning's triumph continue to resonate, serving as a reminder that in the intense crucible of conflict, technological advancement, and meticulous preparation can surmount even the most formidable adversaries. The fork-tailed Devil has rightfully earned its place in history, not solely as a superior fighter aircraft, but as the instrument through which American aviation mastered the skies and ultimately secured victory in the war.